Let's now take a look at the anatomy of the ear. As you can see from this diagram below, there are three areas of the ear: the external ear, shown in yellow, the middle ear, shown in blue, and the internal ear, shown in a pink color. We'll look at each of these regions in the next few slides. The external ear consists of the outer ear, known as the auricle or pinna, and the external auditory canal, and the tympanic membrane, otherwise known as the eardrum. The external ear canal contains within it ceruminous glands. Ceruminous glands make the oils cerumen. Cerumen is otherwise known as earwax. The middle ear consists of the auditory or eustachian tube. This is the tube that goes to the nasopharynx, and we'll talk more about what it does later on. The auditory ossicles, which are bones, the malleus, otherwise known as the hammer, the incus, sometimes known as the anvil, and the stapes, sometimes known as the stirrup. The middle ear also includes the oval window, which is a small membrane that the stirrup vibrates against, and the round window, which is shown here. Here's a close-up that shows the middle ear and the auditory ossicles. We can see the malleus, incus, and stapes. Whenever the tympanic membrane or eardrum vibrates because of sound waves, it will cause the malleus to vibrate. This in turn will vibrate against the incus, which will then cause the stirrup to vibrate. These are actually small synovial joints that are found between these three different bones. As you can see, there are small ligaments that attach these bones to the rest of the skull. There are also two muscles that are involved: the tensor tympani muscle and the stapedius muscle. This muscle is the smallest skeletal muscle in the human body. If a loud noise enters the ear, these two muscles contract in order to stiffen the auditory ossicles and protect the oval window that the stirrup attaches against. This muscle action works only for prolonged sounds and therefore doesn't help with noises like gunshots. The inner ear is called the labyrinth. The word labyrinth means maze, and there's a bony part and there's a membranous part. We'll look at each of these parts in the next few slides. In this diagram, we can see the bony labyrinth, which contains a fluid called perilymph, and the membranous labyrinth, which contains a fluid called endolymph. There are three basic parts to the internal ear: the semicircular canals, an anterior, posterior, and lateral one, an area called the vestibule, and the cochlea. The vestibule, which is a kind of rounded portion, has inside of it two membranous labyrinths called the utricle and the saccule. You'll notice down at the base of each of the semicircular canals that there's a swelling called the ampulla. We'll talk about what these do a little bit later on. Let's now take a look at the cochlea in more detail. The word cochlea means snail-like, and this is where the sensory receptors are found for hearing. This diagram can be a little bit confusing, but we don't need to know a lot of detail in order to understand the anatomy of the cochlea. The cochlear duct, which is shown in this red region, is a passageway that travels through the center of the cochlea. You can see it shown here, and we'll look at a magnified picture of it a little bit later on. Above and below it are two other chambers, scala vestibuli and scala tympani. If we make a cross-section through the cochlea, we can see again the details of the cochlear duct. Shown here is the spiral organ, or organ of Corti, and again we'll take a look at this in greater detail. This is where the sensory receptors are located that are involved in hearing. Here again we can see a cut through the cochlea, and again we can see two chambers above the cochlear duct, the scala vestibuli and the scala tympani. This region that's shown in the box is the spiral organ, or organ of Corti. It's found inside of the cochlear duct. And here we can see a magnified view of the spiral organ. As you can see, what we have here are some hair cells, some called outer hair cells and some called inner hair cells, and they have little hair bundles, and they're embedded up in this thing called a tectorial membrane. And basically what's going to happen, as we will see in more detail later, is that this tectorial membrane is going to vibrate whenever sound waves travel through the cochlea. And when this thing vibrates, it pushes up against these hair bundles, and then that sends a message by means of these nerves over to the brain so as to tell you what you're hearing.